pretty good. So if you know me, or if you've watched me in any of our videos at MPB, you know that I'm primarily a Sony shooter. But before I became more accustomed to Sony, I was more familiar with Canon. In fact, when I was beginning as a freelancer and living in New Jersey, I started out on cameras like the Canon C300 and the Canon 5D Mark III. But then in 2015, right before I moved to New York, I got myself a new camera, the Sony a7S II. Since then, I've operated all sorts of cameras, but my personal gear has sort of remained in the Sony family. And right now, the Sony FX3 is sort of my main go-to camera for a lot of the work that I do. But for this kind of special and kind of weird video, I decided to kind of check back in with Canon and take one of their cinema cameras for a spin. And I chose the Canon C70. I went with the C70 because it's a mid-tier cine camera, good for run-and-gun shooting as well as more professional projects, which is not unlike my Sony FX3. And they're both at similar price points if you buy used. Although the C70 doesn't have a full-frame sensor, it does come with some incredible features that include a wide variety of high bitrate video format options, including internal RAW recording, as well as built-in ND filters, which is a huge win for me. I'm not trying to make this video a comparison to the Sony FX3. I'm just mentioning it a lot because they're kind of competitive price values. And also, it's the camera I'm most used to right now. So I won't try to compare the two very much, but occasionally I might do that. So whatever. So like I said, when I was starting out, I was living in New Jersey. So for this video, I decided to return both to Canon and to the good old Garden State and shoot this review of the Canon C70 at some of my favorite spots along the Jersey Shore.
So just a little aside about the great state of New Jersey. I feel like television and media has kind of created this stigma for the state that if you're not from New Jersey and you hear New Jersey, you usually think of this or you think of this. And there's a lot more to New Jersey than is depicted on television and media. That being said, there is one hilarious, scandalous depiction of New Jersey that, as someone from New Jersey, I just love. And it's from one of my favorite sitcoms ever, called It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And the episode is titled The Gang Goes to the Jersey Shore.
Basically, it's about a group of delinquents who go to the Jersey Shore in an effort to relive their childhood memories of the seaside getaway, only to be wildly disappointed and experience the Jersey Shore as a crime-infested dump.
Yeah! Oh my gosh, this place is amazing! Right? Look at the sea specimens, the stray dogs, the trash that floated over from Europe.
And it's during the episode that Danny DeVito's character, Frank, introduces the world to the Rum Ham.
What's that? You're supposed to get booze.
Oh, this is ham, soaked in rum. It is loaded with booze.
So as a tribute to this amazing moment in television history, in our review of the Canon C70 today, we're going to feature this little beauty in pretty much every one of our test shots. A real delicious rum ham.
First, let's talk custom picture settings and log formats. We shot these tests mainly in C-Log 2 to achieve the best dynamic range for color grading in post. But the C70 also comes with C-Log 3, BT709, PQ, and HLG. Pretty great options that run the gamut depending on your post-production color grading process. You can also import your own LUTs directly into the camera, which is great for monitoring if you don't have an external monitor. You also have your standard options for peaking, focus guide, grids, and also waveforms, zebra, and false color for managing exposure. Now, when it comes to choosing your media formats and resolution, there are actually a lot of options here. First, let's take a look at RAW ST and LT. This is Canon's RAW format, which the C70 can capture internally. I'm not going to go too deep into the difference between ST and LT, But basically at ST, you'll get a higher bitrate with your footage, producing heavier files but theoretically higher quality footage. In LT, although the bitrate is a little lower, you do have the option to capture 60 FPS. It's important to note that these RAW options are different from Canon's Cinema RAW Lite format, which has even less compression and higher quality. But you still get all the flexibility of RAW footage with the Canon C70. If you want to avoid shooting in RAW for a slightly easier post-process, you can shoot in the XF AVC format in 422 10-bit, and when shooting in XF AVC, you have two file compression options, intraframe and long GOP. I don't want to get too technical, but basically long GOP compresses multiple frames, while intraframe goes frame by frame, and technically gives you higher quality footage at a higher bitrate. If you select long GOP, you'll have lower bitrate footage but can shoot up to 60 FPS, whereas the higher quality intraframe footage will only get you to 30 FPS. If you downgrade to MP4, you'll theoretically have an easier time processing this footage in post at the cost of a lower bitrate, but still achieving 422 and 10-bit up to 60 frames per second. Speaking of FPS, if you're looking for 120 frames per second, I didn't find it in any typical frame rate options. I only found the option to shoot in 120 frames per second when recording in any other format besides RAW and changing my recording mode to slow and fast. Personally, I don't mess with SNQ or SNF modes, so we're going to avoid that for this test. So look, I know all this talk about compression and file formats and frame rates can seem like a lot of technical stuff, but it is important to know at least a little bit about all this so you know how these decisions are going to affect your final output. It's also good to know if you have limited media to record on, or if you know what kind of post-production process or turnaround time you're working with. For our tests, we mostly shot in XAVC, jumping between different settings to achieve 24 frames per second and 60 frames per second. Right off the bat, I will say this camera is impressing me, especially considering the Sony camera I'm used to, the FX3, does not have internal RAW capabilities like the C70 does. And even if shooting in RAW isn't your thing, you can get really into the nitty-gritty with your recording formats with the C70. I can understand why people would love this and why others may want something a little simpler. The lack of 120 FPS without going through SNF mode is definitely not heartbreaking. I myself rarely go for 120 FPS unless I'm being particularly stylistic with slow motion. One hit the C70 takes is the lack of a full-frame sensor, which you can find on Sony's FX3 and even on other Canon models. However, super 35mm sensors are not uncommon, especially among higher-end cinema cameras, so it really depends on what sort of look you want to go for. As far as lenses go, the C70 has an RF mount, so you can make use of Canon's RF glass. The C70 also has 5-axis internal image stabilization, which is very helpful when shooting on the shoulder or handheld. You'll see a bit of a crop when you turn on digital IS, which can be a bit of a bummer considering you're already on a 35mm sensor, but it's worth it if you want to avoid shaky footage when in motion. Speaking of crop factor, if you're shooting with anamorphic lenses, you'll see a very handy anamorphic correction option at your disposal. We didn't have any use for this in our tests, but I figured this was a good call out for you anamorphic shooters. But what I really love about this camera is the built-in ND filters. I so f***ing wish the Sony FX3 had internal ND filters, but alas, it does not. The Canon C70 really starts to call to me with this option, especially considering the price point. There's no need to carry a bunch of variable NDs with you or throw a matte box on the camera and slide NDs in one at a time. It's all right internal, and that is, really awesome. You can just go outside and adjust the ND filters as needed. I love this feature, and it really gives the Canon C70 an edge over other cinema cameras that are in a similar price range, particularly against cheaper Canon cinema cameras that are sort of competing in that cine space. So internal ND filters is a huge win for me.
It's really difficult to get.
I never really dreamed of touching autofocus until I experienced what the FX3 had to offer, and let me tell you, it is such a helpful tool when you're shooting run and gun or tracking a subject. But I'd like to see how the Canon C70's autofocus performs. And honestly, in my experience, the Canon C70 performed just as well in terms of autofocus. It even tracked these seagulls for me and helped me keep them in focus. The C70 has plenty of inputs as well, including an HDMI port and plenty of ports for audio. Only bummer is that these are mini XLR ports, not your standard XLR, so we ran with a Video Mic Pro Plus on top for recording audio with the C70. When it comes to handling this camera, the C70 is pretty bulky compared to smaller Canon cameras that have similar or higher res recording capabilities, or compared to my Sony FX3, it is much bigger. But if that's the cost to carry all these special features, it's worth it. And it's still smaller than larger cinema cameras with similar abilities. Now let's quickly see how this camera does in low light. Research suggests a base ISO of 800 for the Canon C70, and not exceeding 3200 to avoid too much noise. So not super impressive low light capabilities, but pretty standard. To round this review out, I want to call attention to the key differences in the C70 versus some other Canon cameras you might be considering. Let's look at the Canon C300 Mark III. It has the same sensor, but has XAVC and Cinema Raw light recording options. And it's almost $2,000 more expensive than the Canon C70 if you buy used. Sure, the C300 Mark III may be considered a true cinema camera, has more input and output options, can achieve 120 frames per second in 4K, and has competitive bitrate options as well as internal ND filters. But I'd take a close look at footage comparisons before throwing down that extra cash. On the other end of the spectrum, we have hybrid cameras like the Canon R5C, which can achieve 8K footage with a full-frame sensor at about $3,150 if you buy used. But it's not a cinema-first camera, so you have to deal with a smaller build and no internal ND filters. While I was making this video, Canon actually announced the Canon C400, and for about $4,000 more expensive, there is some appeal over a camera like the C70. The C400 has a full-frame sensor, impressive 6K RAW recording capabilities, an RF mount, and 4K up to 120 frames per second. I'll say that if you're in the market for a 6K or 8K cine camera from Canon, the C400 is an exciting new addition I'd probably sell a C300 or a C500 for. But for that 3K to 4K range, the C70 really takes the cake for me. So as always, it really depends on what your budget is and what you're shooting. But I found the Canon C70 to be a great Canon camera that sort of sits right between more expensive, higher-end cinema cameras and cheaper, more affordable hybrid cameras. And honestly, I was really impressed with a lot of the footage that we captured with the C70. But, to be honest with you, I'm going to stick with my FX3 and stay in the Sony camp for now in terms of my personal gear. But I definitely recommend the Canon C70 for cinematographers or videographers who primarily use Canon. If you're looking to make a change or upgrade your current Canon camera to the C70, visit MPB today to start buying, selling, and trading right now. I'm Justin with MPB. Thanks for watching.
Wait a minute! Wait a minute! Where's the Rum Ham?
What?
Where's the rum? Rum Ham! I'm sorry, Rum Ham! I'm sorry! Rum Ham! Oh, Rum Ham!